While Sony supplies the vast majority of camera sensors on the market, and the absolute best ones out there to boot, Sony's own phones have not always delivered the best results despite having their own special set of sensors. The Xperia XZ2 utilizes the same sensor as last year's flagship devices from Sony, including that embedded DRAM feature for super slow motion video. The single rear camera is a 19-megapixel Sony IMX400 sensor with 1.22 micron-sized pixels, positioned behind an f-stop 2.0 81-degree angle lens. That's slightly wider than most phones, which are around 71 degrees. The upgrade comes in the form of the ISP on the Snapdragon 845, which now allows up to 1080p video at 960 frames per second, a step up from the 720p video in last year's super slow motion mode. The increased detail in super slow motion is astounding to say the least, and means that we're finally seeing full HD quality super slow motion for the first time from any phone. Outside of Sony's flagships, the only other phones that can do this super slow-mo are the Galaxy S9 and the Huawei P20 Pro, both of which only offer that speed at 720p resolution. The biggest difference between those two phones in terms of quality is that Huawei's implementation can record in less light. Unfortunately, Sony's implementation still has an issue with recording in less than super bright light, and almost anything indoors is going to look extremely dark, just like on the Galaxy S9. Looking at the same scene in 4K from the phone side by side with super slow motion shows the difference pretty clearly. Sony, of course, offers a fill light that helps a bit, but it's not really bright enough to make a significant impact on detail in these darker scenes. Then, of course, there's the software design, which hasn't changed from last year, but is thankfully faster than ever. Sony's super slow motion is set up like this. Go into video mode, hit that super slow motion button, and then hit record. While it's recording at the normal 30 frames per second frame rate, you'll be able to seamlessly inject super slow motion 960 frames per second video by pressing that super slow-mo button. This shows a quick animation, disabling the button while it takes that 3-second burst of slow-mo video, then immediately enables it again so you can grab another moment. There used to be a bit of refresh time between button presses, but it's basically instant now, so you can queue it up as much as you want. Despite this, it's still difficult to time the right moment, as is well exhibited by the recording of this bird. I'm happy with one section near the end, but most of the video is a total miss when it comes to awesome slow motion, simply because birds are kinda hard to predict. There's also some odd focusing issues in super slow motion, and touching anywhere in the viewfinder doesn't actually refocus as it does in regular video mode. It's the highest quality super slow-mo on any phone though, without a doubt, but like the Galaxy S9, it's really only useful in brightly lit conditions. Regular video is some of the most advanced in the industry, but there's some weird caveats to note here as well. First up is smooth video during movement. When comparing it with the Huawei P20 Pro, for instance, which is only optically stabilized, you can tell the difference immediately. The typical jitters from walking barely show up at all in the Xperia XZ2, while they're all too obvious on the P20 Pro. This is a really big deal because most phones don't do better than optical stabilization on video, while Sony adds a second layer of electronic stabilization on top of that hardware-based one. 1080p video is even further stabilized and provides butter-smooth results that we've seen from Sony for years on 1080p video, but other phones have begun to offer this kind of stabilization in 4K, like the OnePlus 6 for example. When comparing a walking scene with the OnePlus 6 in 4K mode, the difference too is quite obvious. Now the Sony looks more like Huawei's shaky video did, simply because the OnePlus 6's video is so well stabilized. There's also some obvious cropping going on in the OnePlus 6 footage here, and a bit of detail is reduced because of it, but the trade-off in OnePlus's methodology is definitely worth the slight loss in detail when compared with Sony's. Zoom quality is excellent too, despite not having a secondary sensor with a telephoto lens. Zooming into 3x exhibits some great detail, and while it's never going to be as good as something like the Huawei P20 Pro with its optical zoom capabilities, the sensor Sony uses here is still plenty detailed. It's also nicely stabilized too, and the tables turn in Sony's favor this time around when comparing with the OnePlus 6, as zoomed-in video is far more stable on the Xperia XZ2 than either of these phones. Dynamic range is also excellent and is generally as good or better than the industry average in this regard. Comparing with the OnePlus 6 in the same lighting conditions as before, show near identical imagery as far as dynamic range is concerned, and excellent color reproduction as well. Things really ramp up when you turn on HDR video, easily done by flicking that very obvious switch on the interface, but 4K video is limited to 24 frames per second at this time, so it appears a little less smooth than SDR 4K video from the device. When comparing to the Huawei P20 Pro again, the difference is incredibly obvious. While the P20 Pro struggles to deliver a normalized exposure with the bright sky in view, the Xperia XZ2 shows far better exposure averages, exhibiting detail in the clouds while still maintaining detail and lighting conditions in the trees below. HDR video should offer not just enhanced dynamic range though, it should also offer more accurate colors that are deeper and more realistic than on SDR video. However, what we get are colors that often look muted and footage that tends to look a bit overexposed when compared with SDR footage from this phone. This isn't an artifact of rendering this particular video in SDR versus HDR, it seems to either be a codec issue or some strange incompatibility with native clients like YouTube. Uploading the video directly to YouTube from the phone results in colors that look smudgy and muddy when playing back in SDR, and when HDR is enabled, things go crazy 80s neon central. It's impressive to see native 4K HDR recording on the phone, that's HDR10 to be specific, but it appears things need to be perfected a bit before we'll get any good use out of it. Photo quality is nothing short of impressive in basically every way imaginable. Zoom detail on this thing is insane. Of course, every situation isn't going to deliver the same results, but in general, these are the most detailed shots we've seen on a Sony phone, and with this kind of quality in more situations than ever. Many other phones from Sony suffered from this heat haze looking pattern when zooming in all the way, and while we can obviously reproduce this one in some lighting conditions and some objects, it's not present in the vast majority of situations, even in general low-light shots. In the daylight, it easily competes with even Huawei's massive 40-megapixel sensor on the P20 Pro, although Huawei still comes ahead in ultra-fine detail if you look very close in most of these photos. Some of these shots are really mind-blowing with their detail level, and the phone does an absolutely fantastic job of focusing on the right subject. At first, it seems like there's an issue with the camera where it refocuses on every shot every time you take the photo, but in reality, the phone is actually taking several shots at once, and at times will show up to 4 shots taken in an attempt to automatically identify the best one. Oftentimes, I found that the shutter timing was the best shot, but there were enough times that the phone saved my butt and proved that this automated capture really made a difference. It also means this phone is absolutely fantastic for people that have children or pets, as it uses motion in the scene to determine if these automated groups of shots need to be chosen. Those that want a little more manual control over focusing or shutter timing can either use that hardware shutter key on the side of the phone, which functions like a point-and-shoot camera, giving you the ability to prime the focus and take the shot at a moment's notice, or of course just use the manual mode with manual focus if you're not happy with the autofocus results. Dynamic range and contrast are both spectacular in most cases, and the camera automatically switches between available scene types on the fly as it detects different objects and lighting conditions. Sony started doing this basically before anyone else, but has not updated its language to reflect what many OEMs call AI cameras, even though it basically works the same way. Software design is exactly the same we've seen from Sony for a while now, and while I really like how Sony handles the UI design on the super slow motion mode, for example, separating video and photo modes in the regular interface is always irritating, and the only real available modes within a swipe or two are going to be photo, video, and manual. Everything else is located all the way over in this far section, and all of these separate modes are separate apps, which not only require the phone to be unlocked to use, but don't even go back to the main camera app when you're done with them. While I appreciate the plugin design Sony is trying for here, the implementation is terrible, slow, and clunky as heck. Low light has been significantly improved from previous generations of Sony phones, and typically grabs tons of detail even in low light examples. While there were exceptions, it seemed to beat the OnePlus 6 in sheer detail and available light in all but the lowest of lighting conditions, and at times even did a better job than the Huawei P20 Pro in this regard. Taking it out one night shows that little details like wood grain in the cabinet or the bricks on this building's wall get lost in OnePlus's processing entirely, while Sony's still retains the look of the texture even if it's not as finely detailed as it would be during the day. Sony is able to ramp that ISO up to 12,000 when really needed, which brightens up the scene quite a lot, but of course makes the shot super soft because of all the noise that would otherwise be present. Comparing it to the Huawei P20 Pro in a cave, yes, a cave, shows Huawei's shots to be sharper and more detailed, and we found one example on a dimly lit residential street where the Xperia XZ2 captured more light than the OnePlus 6, but details were lost in what is actually able to be seen. Color accuracy in lower lighting tends to be overly warm, and while this is a nice touch in dim or moderate light, it can look pretty bad in very low light because of this. This was not super common by any means though, but it did crop up enough times to note. Lastly, we'll take a look at the front-facing camera, which is a 5-megapixel, 1/5 inch sensor with an f-stop 2.2 86-degree wide-angle lens. This nice wide lens captures more than many other smartphones, and I really like how Sony treats contrast and exposure in well-lit conditions. Dynamic range is quite nice as a result, oftentimes looking more balanced and color accurate than leading flagships, but that 5 megapixel resolution and tiny sensor size can become really obvious in lower lighting conditions. Aside from these lower lighting conditions though, I preferred the look of the Xperia XZ2's front-facing camera over most other smartphones, maybe sans the Google Pixel, which of course typically wins in most scenarios thanks to its high-resolution large sensor and Google's incredible HDR+ algorithms for significantly widening dynamic range. For darker conditions, the fill flash can be used, and again, I preferred Sony's methodology here, which delivers a more evenly lit flash that looks less harsh than competitors. All in all, it's an extremely impressive accomplishment by Sony, which can now happily sit near the top of the stack in overall photo and video quality once again. Sony's camera UI needs some serious updating though, and remains one of the clunkiest designs around despite delivering fantastic results, and keeps any of those extra modes from being viable in most situations, not only because it's incredibly slow to even bring them up, but because most of them also feel very slow and outdated. We hope you enjoyed that review and will subscribe to us for regularly updated content. Chat with us in your favorite social media network, and don't forget to check out AndroidHeadlines.com for 24/7 tech news coverage. Thanks for watching, and until next time.